Hello and welcome once again to another session of College English Composition 2, Section 3004 with me, Mr. Fowler, your inimitable host, once again sorting through the wild world of our text for this semester, The Princess Bride. Now today we're going to wrap up Chapter 5, and as we do so, I'm going to introduce some interesting questions that I feel are interesting. Ideas about the nature of relationships, and maybe even some questions about the nature of our central characters themselves. I hope you'll join me. Real quickly, I just also wanted to mention that last week I made a little flub. I forgot to upload the weekly discussion questions. And of course, once a couple of wonderful students had made me aware of that, it was pretty late in the week. It was like Thursday afternoon. And yes, I could have scrambled and put out a question for everybody to complete, but at that point, that's a little bit more work than I intended for you as students to have to endure. So I just let it slide last week. There is a discussion question posed for this week, though. So we'll make this the week 6 question, since we sort of missed that. And we'll just stagger the responses as we continue to progress. We'll make it up, in other words. So don't worry about that. Secondly, papers are all accounted for, and things looked great. I thought your revisions on the ad analysis were just perfect. So it's important that I get those back to you today because, of course, this week we're going to start thinking about the persuasive essay. And I want to spend a little bit of time today looking at or exploring an example of how you can use inductive reasoning, which we studied in Chapter 5 of Practical Argument, to facilitate a response for a persuasive essay. So that's our agenda today. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll stop my video feed, but you should still hear my dulcet tones as I share some material with you. All right. So let's begin our slideshow from the beginning. So for today, section 16, can you believe it? We're halfway through the semester. Specifically, I want to put not too much. So last time, remember that Warren and Gregor shared a sort of symbiotic relationship in which they basically thrive by going to war against one another. And then one little skirmish, something in the Jew, something about the emperor, the battle of the emperor. They went to war again after robbing everybody else when they both got broke, and then they went to war dividing up profits of what they had stolen. There had been a hope for peace, as described in the beginnings of chapter 3. The Humperdinck rejects the Princess of Gilder, and because she's bald, Princess Narina, and it's just not going to work out. But he has always had that hunter man of action sort of mentality, and it may come to bite him in the behind eventually. But as of now, he thinks it may be easier to conquer Gilder through war than to be at peace with them through a marriage he finds unacceptable. Interestingly, rather than marry Buttercup and just live a healthy and happy life, he believes that if he introduces her to the people, they will fall in love with her due to her great beauty and her civility toward them, because she herself was once, of course, a commoner. Now, once he's done this, he realizes that he will easily have the backing of his own people, the Florinese people, in going to war if they were to suspect that Buttercup was murdered by an agent of Gilder. So he arranges for his bride-to-be, Buttercup, to be kidnapped and murdered with her body placed on the frontier of Gilder. However, the three kidnappers, Inigo, Montoya, Fezzik the Giant, and Vizzini, just the hunchback, are surprised to find themselves pursued by a man in black. First on a ship, and then they discover him climbing up after them as they ascend the Cliffs of Insanity. Atop the Cliffs of Insanity, Inigo Montoya is left behind to kill him. But despite years of study and skill, and being armed with a 9-foot 6-fingered sword that his father, Inigo Montoya, had crafted, Inigo is bested by the Man in Black. And now the Man in Black comes in pursuit of Fezzik, Vizzini, and of course Buttercup, who is his actual goal. As such, Vizzini dispatches Fezzik to crush the Man in Black's skull. But Fezzik has other ideas. He does hurl a stone at the Man in Black with his mighty strength, smacking it into a boulder right where his head would have been. But Fezzik is more interested in fairness, and his real talents lie in physical fighting and wrestling. And that is how he hopes to challenge the Man in Black. In a relatively humorous exchange, the Man in Black, caught off guard by Fezzik's fair play, says, "You mean you'll just put down your rock and I'll put down my sword and we'll try to kill each other as civilized people should?" And of course he says, "Well, I could kill you with a rock if you'd rather." And of course the Man in Black accepts. Now this section of the book is nicknamed or subtitled Fezzik. And we spend a lot of time, as we did with Inigo Montoya, learning about the backstory of this giant. Of course, he is the only Turkish baby on record to be born weighing in at over 24 pounds. Now, we're also told it's not too strange for Turkish children to be born about 20 pounds and then quickly lose weight because they're large and hardy stock. This, of course, is ridiculous exaggeration. But that doesn't happen with Fezzik. He is a literal giant from birth. But because of his distinctive physical appearance, he's often teased and spurned. I know that seems like an odd idea to be picked on for being bigger or to be ridiculed for being larger. But consider a story about the actual Andre the Giant who portrayed Fezzik in the film. Andre the Giant was a larger-than-life character and a man of physical prowess and a bit of a ladies' man, epic drinker. But when he had to travel, everybody else who traveled with him, all the other wrestlers, were relaxed. They were large men, but they were still able to sit in the accommodating seats of the airplane. Andre the Giant had to ride bent over for the entire flight, which is sometimes in excess of 3 hours. And when nature would call, as it certainly does for most people who have to sit for that period of time, Andre the Giant couldn't use the bathroom. He literally had to go back to the galley areas of the kitchen where the curtains could be drawn between the various class sections of the plane, and he was given a bucket to take care of his business. I realize that a life of showmanship and pomp and circumstance is, uh, perhaps more than makes up for some of the basic necessities. But imagine how uncomfortable something like that would make the majority of us feel. So if we apply that to a literary analysis of this character, an instance like that from real life, it may be a little easier to understand why somebody might be teased or ostracized because of their excess strength and height and stature. But again, like Inigo, Fezzik has loving parents who refuse to see their child trampled upon. So his father simply commands that there is to be no more crying or avoiding confrontation in life, that Fezzik must learn to fight. And his father, a carpenter with large hands himself, teaches him how to fight. And at first, poor Fezzik can't even make a fist. He says you have to take your thumb out of your fingers to make sure that you don't break your thumb. It's okay if your opponent breaks a thumb, but that's not going to help us. You have to form a fist with your thumb on the outside. So real basics. So Fezzik and Inigo, again, both come from loving parents. Inigo is often found helping his father create the weapons, including the six-fingered sword that he makes for Count Rugen. Fezzik has more hands-on parents, though, sometimes to their detriment, as Fezzik's father learns when he gives him his first boxing lesson. He makes Fezzik throw a punch, and when it connects, it, of course, breaks his father's jaw. And there's a wonderful little moment here in the book about Fezzik's father having to wait for the milkman, because as our author, William Goldman, describes in one of his asides, one of his parenthetical additions, at this point in time, there was a debate over who was going to be responsible for dentistry, dentists or milkmen, because they did know enough to understand that milk was important to the growth of strong bones. So he had to wait for not a dentist, but the milkman to come and attend to him. I thought that was hilarious. This is clearly a little aside about the dietary regulations and necessities of young children who may be reading or may have had the story read to them, which I think is just charming. Fezzik, of course, breaks his father's jaw when he throws his first punch, and his father communicates, or attempts to communicate in a rather comedic way, which of course puts me right in mind with Humperdinck, who is in some ways an interesting contrast to Fezzik. Humperdinck is kind of a nigh perfect physical specimen, aside from this odd tendency he has to walk like a crab. But he's a man of action. He's an athlete, a hunter, a warmonger. But his father, too, continues to communicate in a comedic way. It almost seems like Fezzik and Humperdinck are sort of foils, right? If one could be, exchanged for the other, their lives might have been better in some way, shape, or form. So Fezzik becomes sort of a freakish champion in wrestling and fighting. He travels all over Turkey, his home country, and then goes on to Greece, winning each and every match. Later, he goes to the Orient and learns all about the various martial arts that exist in those areas, and he defeats every champion that he comes across. But interestingly, the audience hates him. They call him Ape because of his bestial-like appearance. They hate his overwhelming strength. And even when his father suggests that he try to look as though he were suffering a little bit during the battle, he can't seem to gain the audience's sympathy. Now, over here on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see an image called The Giant by Francisco de Goya. And in this instance, you see a giant who is like a giant in Godzilla types of proportions or King Kong scale. You can see the scattered and worried people down below him. A giant akin to Greek mythology. Now, Fezzik's not that kind of a giant, but in this painting, de Goya is trying to depict something akin to the fear of war and how it brings chaos and uncertainty to the lives of a common everyday person. We're going to speculate in just a few minutes about what a type of giant like Fezzik might represent within this genre. And so here's where we see the first important connections between Fezzik and the man who played him in the iconic film adaptation. Fezzik finally does win approval by fighting multiple people at once. And that feat is what seems to elevate him into the realm of acceptable ability as a fighter. Shortly after this battle between himself and 4 different horsemen in the Gobi Desert, he leaves his parents and joins a circus. Still a teenager, but the other circus performers quickly resort to the sort of ridicule and disdain that he had known in childhood. For one thing, they complain that he eats more than his share because he's a giant person. He needs more sustenance. And so they say that's unfair, where he gets more attention and he gets more food than the rest of us. So they can't come to terms. And during a stint traveling with that circus in Greenland, he is abandoned. And as they say in the book, again, comically, Greenland is perhaps one of the more isolated places in America or in the world, one of the most lonely places. And there, in a state of depression, is where Vizzini, the hunchback Sicilian, finds him at his lowest point. And he recruits him to be part of his team of ne'er-do-wells. Now, interestingly, the heel character in wrestling is the character that fans love to hate. And that's part of contemporary wrestling or sports entertainment as we know it today. And this aspect of the character was quite well understood by Andre the Giant, who ended up playing Fezzik in the film adaptation. Although, for a while, it was supposed to be Arnold, the Austrian oak. And you can see on the left a comparison between the two. The book, remember, was originally published in 1973, and there was a chance that the film was going to be made as early as 1976, with a then unknown Arnold stepping into the role of Fezzik. But that fell through. And perhaps it was best that it did, because as you can see on the right-hand side here, we can see Arnold himself on the set of Conan the Destroyer, flanked by Wilt Chamberlain on his immediate left, and then Andre the Giant on his right. So I think they made the proper choice in selecting Fezzik, or Andre the Giant, to play Fezzik, as the kind of tough, angular proportions that Schwarzenegger worked so hard to define do make him a giant amongst men. I think even in the field of competitive bodybuilding, at 6'2", he was a relatively tall and large specimen. Spoiler here. While it does tend, or it has tended to vary or change a little bit in the past few years, traditionally a lot of muscle men and bodybuilders are actually a little bit on the average to shorter side. So Arnold, at that point in time, at least, had bucked that particular trend by being 6'2" and is rippling with muscle. He looked like a comic book superhero, perhaps for the first time. he and a few other guys like Franco Columbo kind of inspired the bodybuilders of today, whose aesthetic is way different and way larger, but also perhaps not as classically defined as some of their musculature. But anyway, Mr. Fowler will halt his digression. When we open the chapter, we see a decisive battle. Much like Inigo before him, though, Fezzik is bested by the Man in Black. We're told that realistically, Fezzik has the heart of a poet who's obsessed with rhyming and the thoughts of lyricism. He doesn't love love fighting to begin with, but he just is good at it because of his size and his strength. So I wondered if in the battle with Inigo Montoya, does Inigo Montoya fail because he's fighting not for the revenge that he was designed for, that he trained for all his life? Is his heart not in it? The Man in Black's heart is in it. He wants to rescue Buttercup for whatever reason. But again, Inigo didn't really battle with honorable intentions. And Fezzik here, again, he doesn't fight for honor, at least not this time. He's fighting because he's one of Vizzini's paid assassins. And of course, we get a great line here. Another example of Mr. Fowler sort of taking us down a tangent, but I can't ignore it, right? Who knew the Man in Black would be proven correct all the way in 2020, as Fezzik asks, why is it that you wear a mask and a hood? And the Man in Black answers by saying, I think everybody will in the near future. They're terribly comfortable. And here we see ourselves faced with a young lady who's got a face mask on with just those exact lines repeated on her face mask, which we've all grown quite accustomed to over the last almost 6 months. Interesting. I think everybody will be wearing them in the near future. That is an understatement. I also always enjoyed this line because if you've seen the film adaptation or any of the visuals I've used in the past PowerPoints, you know that Wesley wears, the Man in Black wears a hooded scarf and a mask. And he predicts 19th century characters like Zorro and the Lone Ranger, superheroes that we see in film and television today. Only he doesn't really predict them because the book was written in 1973, way after most of those characters were created. So a funny little line in any event. So here, again, we're asked this question about giants. How do we as a contemporary audience make sense of giants like this character? Because they appeared frequently in medieval literature. They were sort of just this odd fascination. We have a big gap in time where the famous giant Cyclops or Cyclops, depending on how you pronounce it, the Greeks did not have a C, right? They had Ks. So technically, I guess we were supposed to be calling them Cyclops this entire time? Whatever. I'm going to stick with what I know, and that's Cyclops. In any event, the first Cyclops the first giant that we know is the Cyclops from the Iliad, the Odyssey. I misspoke. From the Odyssey. He traps Odysseus and his men in a cave and eats them whole. So we have this sort of taboo quality of giants as cannibals and giant creatures that are unnatural. But after that point in ancient humanities or ancient letters, we really don't see too many giants until the medieval explosion of literature. And then giants crop up all the time. There are giants everywhere. especially if you read any of the Arthurian cycle of literature by, again, and our friend Geoffrey Chaucer has some giants in his work, but Morte d'Arthur features a couple of instances where the knights, the round table, face down a giant. So why are they so frequently alluded to in medieval literature? I don't know. I suppose on one instance they could be a reference to tyrannical kings. And we have some evidence of this because later giants are replaced by dragons. And it's pretty evident that dragons, especially in traditional literature, are actually intelligent. They just don't breathe fire, they speak. And I think in Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit series, we get a speaking, well, the Hobbit's one book, but it's part of the Lord of the Rings cycle, pardon me. But we do get the instance of Smaug, who is a speaking dragon, and he's intelligent, and he's eloquent, as well as deadly. And traditionally, theorists have analyzed literature and analyzed literary dragons and come away with an idea that they are representative of a tyrannical king, as they usually hoard over and adore treasure, specifically gold. They could be also, I think, a reference to the superiority of nature over man, or some force that cannot be overcome, because there have to be some limits on the nature of the heroes. Otherwise, they become like Supermen, right? They quickly paint themselves into a corner in so much as they can't be defeated. So I suppose a hero should have some form of limitation, and a giant is a good potential antagonist for these types of larger-than-life heroes. There's also a sense that in the medieval period, a lot of people began to ask questions about traditional passages from biblical literature. Now, a lot of Judeo-Christian literature is based on what we think of as the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses that describe the creation of the world under Judeo-Christian thought. Sometimes these are often included in a Jewish religious book called the Talmud. And this includes, again, that Pentateuch, the first 5 books of what we, in the Christian tradition, would call the Pentateuch, or the books of Moses. And there's a troubling passage. There's more than a few troubling passages, but one is the passage that comes to us from Genesis 32, chapter 32, verse 22 to 32, in which the Hebrew patriarch Jacob wrestles with an angel, or wrestles, as the text suggests, with God himself. And the match goes on for several days. And of course, you cannot defy in the realm of religious doctrine or belief, you can't defy the will of God, or you cannot defeat the messenger of God, an angel, something like that. So in that sense of religious mythology, giants get conflated with visitors or angelic beings. We also have a giant in the book of, I can't remember which book right now, but we have the story of, I don't think it's the book of David, but there's a battle between David and Goliath, which is a famous battle. Whether or not Goliath is a real person, we tend to believe that now that he is, as we've seen some historic evidence with that name that appeared. So it's very likely that there may have been someone named Goliath. Then we also have to take into account the fact that the average height in the period of in which the Bible is supposed to, these biblical stories are supposed to have taken place, was about 4'10", or maybe 5 feet. So a giant man of 7 feet would have been truly giant, even though it's not too strange anymore to hear about men who scale in at 6'7", 6'8". A lot of basketball players today weigh in or scale in about 6'7". I think Michael Jordan was 6'7", if I'm not mistaken. I'm sure there are some sports fans out there who will be more than happy to correct me if I'm off base. But this idea of what a giant might represent is one that's open to interpretation. And this may be the basis for another excellent potential topic for a persuasive essay. Maybe you can research this idea of what is a giant? And what does a giant represent in a literary sense for medieval literature and high romance? It's just a thought. Of course, Fezzik does represent something specific that we can draw our attention to in the context of The Princess Bride, and that's this resiliency. Fezzik doesn't give up. He doesn't technically lose the battle, he just passes out. He's choked out by the man in black after a long battle, in which he almost crushes him against a boulder. This is played for great comedic effect in the film adaptation. But maybe there's something to learn here about persistence. Fezzik doesn't give up. He keeps doing things the way he has always done them. He's a fighter, literally and figuratively. He fights on because that's what life has taught him to do. That's how he has learned to survive the pitfalls and foibles of a life in an unfair world. Also, he was Goldman's favorite character. And I think it's not necessarily happenstance that he resists as much as he can. He struggles until it's ultimately over. At the end of the conflict, of course, the man in black says, all right, 2 down and the hardest of the kidnappers to go. He comes upon Vizzini and Buttercup in a sort of picnic-like environment, much like the film adaptation, except it occurs at nighttime. So this is all under the baleful view of a bright full moon. Vizzini explains that he predicts the truth. He is not a mind reader, as some people believe him to be, but that he predicts the truth using logic and wisdom. Now, we've seen him do this a couple of times. When Buttercup was first awakened on the boat, he knew that she was listening. He sometimes can predict that, what people are thinking before they say it. But he's also capable of being foiled. The man in black foils him vis-a-vis his actions. Buttercup takes him by surprise when she jumps off of the ship earlier trying to save herself. But again, he emphasizes and has a great appreciation for logic and wisdom. He thinks these are the only ways, the tools that you can use to make it through life. Which is interesting because, as we know, logic and wisdom do not often dictate the way that life occurs or the events that unfold in our lives. They don't always have a logical reason. Being a wise person does not mean you can be prepared for every contingency. But Vizzini has and does risk his life on the basis that those are the tools that can get you, those are the exclusive tools that can guide one through life. Yet for being all of his belief in logic, he's a killer for hire, which I find to be kind of circumspect. It's just because you're intelligent doesn't mean you should be able to indulge in something erroneous and horrible as becoming an assassin. Even more puzzling is the fact that he is quickly dispatched via a trick. So his wits aren't really truly tested. There's no way he could figure out the puzzle that the man in black presents to him. So it's not his wisdom that is challenged and defeated. It's just a trick that, as I said before, cannot be deduced even with you know, a host of wise knowledge behind you. And of course, this leads to another question. Was Vizzini really truly a genius? He may have been. You know, if the iocane powder had not dispatched him, I'm not sure that he would have died. I'm not sure that the man in black could have outsmarted him. And he had Buttercup in a very precarious position. So he could have dispatched her before the man in black was able to trick him. As he said, there may be, as Vizzini said, there may be others who know more in terms of book learning, but in terms of actual life experience, there is no one else I've ever met who is as wise as I am. That may very well have been true, but the man in black uses 2 poison goblets and relies on his resistance that he's built up, his immunity, to win the day, whereas Vizzini, of course, dies laughing. Let's talk about the man in black. Of course, first of all, it's Wesley. Spoilers if you've never seen the film adaptation. You learn it by the end of chapter 5 anyway. But now that we know this, I have to ask some important questions about the way he treats Buttercup after he's rescued her from the 3 kidnappers. Now, we do learn later that he was captured by the Dread Pirate Roberts, as reported earlier in the book. But in that process, he becomes the Dread Pirate Roberts' valet, right? The person who takes care of his clothes, his boots, his equipment, is kind of his right-hand man. To keep it in pirate terms, he's the Smee to Captain Hook, right? But Dread Pirate Roberts eventually, rather than killing Wesley, which he promises to do each morning when the 2 of them awake, changes his mind and explains that he's only the latest in a long line of men going back to the original Dread Pirate Roberts who retire and then pass the mantle on to someone else. So they get rid of the crew. The 2 of them go ashore. Wesley takes on the identity of the Dread Pirate Roberts, and they recruit an entire new crew who are more than willing to sign up because of his sordid reputation. And now, as far as that new crew knows, they're sailing with the original and dastardly Dread Pirate Roberts. So perhaps this entire exchange has changed Wesley. Maybe he is a more bitter person, or I don't know, angrier at the world due to his circumstances. But I still have to ask, is the way he treats Buttercup misogynistic? Okay. Misogyny, again, is defined, I think, as hatred toward women. And it's a word that, and a term, I suppose, that has garnered a lot of attention in the last couple of years. Often it's used as a blanket term to sort of assign any sort of sexist thought or principle as misogynistic. I think that's going, personally, I feel like that's taking the language a bit far. I think there's a distinction between sexism and misogyny. I've always tended to think of misogyny as like a Norman Bates level of hatred specifically toward women for reasons that might not be like psychologically sound. But I'm finding myself in a relative minority here in terms of the use of the connotative word and the denotative word. I think canonically it means a psychological hatred or despisement toward women, whereas perhaps denotatively it's just meant to, as a blanket term now, to define any kind of sexism. I'm not sure. But since I asked the question in the essay prompt for the persuasive essay, does he treat her in a misogynistic manner? I want to explore that potential. Wesley begins by answering Buttercup's question about who he is by saying that he's no one to be trifled with. And, she says, if you let me go, I'll pay you. And he says, oh, a rich woman, eh? Someone who will simply pay to be set free. And she says, yeah, and I'll promise you no harm will come to you. And he says, what's that worth, the vow of a woman? And he says, though, you think your greatest love will save you. And she said, I didn't say he was my greatest love. And he says, oh, so you admit that you do not love your husband to be. Fancy that, an honest woman. So he just really lays into her this entire time. And I have to ask, what game is he getting at? Well, we'll explore that in a minute. Buttercup has her own, and I think at this point, relatively benign and well-reasoned responses to some of this nonsense. Buttercup isn't always the most logical person. She makes a really ridiculous mistake. She means to say that I believe you every single syllable, and she says syllabub. And then we have this ridiculous sort of English teachery response from William Goldman. He says, well, a syllabub is something, an herb that you spread on bread with butter or something like that. But here, before that instance, I think she really holds her own. And she says, I've loved more deeply than a killer like you could ever possibly imagine. And she's savvy enough to know that his threats, and he even strikes her at one point for saying something that he believes is a lie. And she says, you wouldn't kill me because you didn't steal me from murderers to only murder me yourself. And that's reasonable, right? And in defending the relationship that she has with Prince Humperdinck, she admits that it's complicated. And she says, we are always very honest with each other, and not everyone can say as much. And I think that's also a very telling moment in the relationship, because honesty is something that is a valued commodity when it comes to relationships. At least it is from Goldman's perspective. So honesty takes on a pivotal role in the nature of relationships. Now, Wesley kind of continues to pick at Buttercup. He says, you're very cold and very young, and if you live, I think you'll turn to hoarfrost. To which Buttercup says, look, I loved once, but it worked out badly. And Wesley taunts her again, and he says, oh yeah, probably a rich man who left you for another richer woman. And she said, no, he was poor, and that is what got him killed. Trying to change that is what led to him dying. And he said, yeah, and what did you do? You ran off and married the first rich man who came along. And he said, were you sorry? Did you feel pain? Admit that you felt nothing. And she cries out, do not mock my grief. I died that day. And here we have the real truth behind why Wesley puts up this whole disguised persona as the Dread Pirate Roberts. He's unsure of what happened. He probably had every intention of even letting Buttercup go free if it were true that she did break his heart and she did marry a prince. Because all he had to go by up until this point was teenage Buttercup circa age 18. Now at a 21-year-old age where she had grieved the loss of her true love and become the Princess Bride, she's a different woman. And he wants to make sure that she really is a different woman, that she really doesn't love Prince Humperdinck. Because if she did, I would have to imagine that he wouldn't want to stand in her way. But he trusts his instincts that she did love him as much as he truly loved her. And in life, as we've learned throughout the book, that's quite a gamble, but at least it paid off. So she shoves him down a cliff at this point. And I have to say right on here, because she has it with his nitpicky nonsense and shoves him down a ravine. But in the process, his mask and his hood fall off, and he shouts out, "As you wish." And of course, she recognizes this as his calling card from when he was Wesley the farm boy. And I like this image because obviously this is a reference to Robin Wright Penn, who went on to play one of the warriors that trained Wonder Woman, and she sort of stood on her own. And when, spoilers if you haven't seen Wonder Woman, when an unfortunate circumstance comes to pass for her character in Wonder Woman, I think a lot of people are like, you cannot do that to the Princess Bride, but they did. And maybe that was why they chose her for that particular role. In the meantime, we learn, of course, that Prince Humperdinck is not one to just sit idly by. He's tracked the action that we have been reading about so far in Chapter 5, from the site of the kidnapping to the duel atop the Cliffs of Insanity to the battle with Fezzik, and he even discovers the body of Vizzini. At which point he can see Buttercup and the Man in Black, Wesley, heading down to the channel of Gilder. So he mobilizes the Florinese armada to cut them off. Now for the fire. Oh, hold on. I love the fact that this chapter also contains another one of these creative asides where the character or narrator of Goldman interrupts the flow of the action. Of course, Buttercup throws herself to the bottom of the ravine to be with Wesley. And it's here that he explains he wrote his own scene instead of the original Morgenstern version, which ignores the reunion of the two separated lovers, because Morgenstern at this point just goes off and talks about how much his wife loved his writing and how intelligent she found him to be. So he says, that's not important. People don't really care about the life of the author. While, of course, inserting a big portion about the life of our author, William Goldman, into the middle of the story. And of course, this scene is hilariously edited in the film adaptation as well. But in this version, the teenage grandson interrupts the grandfather, asking him to avoid the kissing parts. In which case, the grandfather says, well, okay, I'll move on. But you know, when you get older, you might not mind the kissing parts so much. And there's even a note about how you can look up the reunion scene and read it at your leisure on princessbridebook.com. But if you are able to go there, then you already know why this slide is titled Thanks Kermit, because Kermit Schmog has prevented us from reading it due to being the literary representative of the Morgenstern estate. And if you haven't gone to the website and read that yet, it's quite a bit of fun. So if you have some free time this week or this weekend and you're idly glancing through the internet, go ahead and check out princessbridebook.com and read the legalese that's provided to us vis-a-vis Kermit Schmog. Now, on to the Fire Swamp. This is another trope of the medieval adventure story. Heroes will often succeed in small ways only to fail and become captured, usually after facing an odd or supernatural threat. Again, the Arthurian cycle is rife with these kinds of examples. Almost to a T, every knight travels abroad, performs some feat of daring do, then goes on in his adventures. He usually saves a damsel, or confronts an evil knight, or confronts a giant, or another group of knights. And although he battles valiantly, he's often defeated and hauled off to a dark dungeon where he's held prisoner. The same thing happens to Wesley in our novel. But he's injured, first of all, during his tropes, or during the passage through the fire swamp. I meant to say traipse, during his traipse through the fire swamp, but I confused those two words. So again, we have a supernatural threat in the fire swamp. And we even get a really nice primer on fire swamps in general, which are simply swamps with sulfur pits that burst into flame randomly. We also encounter things like snow sand or lightning sand, which we would sometimes refer to today as quicksand, which are a pitfall, a literal pitfall of the fire swamp. And not to ignore the best or save the best for last, rodents of unusual size, big rats who are allowed to evolve naturally in a completely, what would you say, predator-free zone. Right? There are no predators to stop them from evolving and becoming a dominant species, so they're gigantic rats. More importantly, though, I think it's interesting to note that, again, the fire swamps were often used to frighten children into obedience. And Wesley and Buttercup both remember having nightmares about the fire swamp as children. So I don't know if this is an attempt, a heavy-handed attempt to suggest like the foreshadowing of something negative happening in the fire swamp. But in terms of the plot, they have to cut through the fire swamp, which is something that Wesley had not originally planned to do. But he needs to do that because he's been cut off from his ship, the Revenge, which is anchored closely on the other side. So if they're going to avoid Prince Humperdinck and the Armada, they're going to have to cut through the fire swamp to make up time. But the fire swamp proves to be trickier than perhaps even Wesley had encountered. So as they make their way through the fire swamp, Count Rugen and Prince Humperdinck and his men circle around it, but they must end up with relatively equal time spent going around or through the fire swamp. Because as they exit, the Florinese Armada has arrived, and the Revenge has no chance but to pull up anchor and avoid the Armada. It has to sail away. So that leaves Wesley and Buttercup stranded. And as they exit the fire swamp, they're surrounded by Prince Humperdinck and his men. Interestingly, the fact that his ship, Wesley's ship, is called the Revenge, it's probably a two-part reference. It's obviously a pirate reference to Blackbeard, one of the most famous real-life pirates, named John Teach in reality. But his ship was supposed to be one of the best in the English Armada, called the Queen Anne's Revenge. So shortening that to the Revenge gives us a linkage subliminally to the Dread Pirate Roberts and Blackbeard, or the Queen Anne's Revenge and his ship, the Revenge. But revenge also seems to be a theme that runs throughout the book. We know that Inigo is on a quest for vengeance, and those two components are kind of neatly linked together in the film adaptation. But we'll talk about how this concept of revenge keeps coming up, and whether or not revenge is really that forest that confuses us and makes it difficult for us to remember where it is that we came in on that path. Buttercup sues her peace, and she says, okay, Wesley refuses to surrender. He says, we could go back into the fire swamp and you could chase us, but we know it a little bit better now than you do, and your men might be in a greater degree of danger. But Buttercup says, no, let's not do that. She says, if Wesley and I surrender freely and without struggle, if life returns to what it was one dusk ago, will you swear not to harm Wesley? Of course, Prince Humperdinck agrees. We know he's a bit of a scoundrel because he's organized the whole process of Buttercup being kidnapped and almost murdered. But Buttercup doesn't know this. We're privy to information she doesn't have, right? They make the agreement, okay, Wesley will not be harmed, and she rides off with Prince Humperdinck on one of his wonderful white horses. We're not sure specifically that they're stallions, but they're big, beautiful white riding horses. And that concludes chapter 5. Wesley actually is the one who gets rescued at the end. Well, as I say to you, technically they do rescue one another. But left in the presence of Count Rugen, Wesley says, all right, let's give up this ridiculous pretense. We're men of action. We both know what's going on here. And Count Rugen compliments him on his savvy. But as he's clubbed into unconsciousness, he has time to note that Count Rugen does have 6 fingers. And he immediately flashes back to his conversation with Inigo Montoya, setting up a greater conflict to play out as the book unfolds. One little nice note here also from the film, Count Rugen hides the fact that he has 6 fingers on his right hand because he wears a glove, but the glove itself also has 6 fingers. I thought that was a funny little giveaway. Okay, for next time, don't forget to complete the weekly discussion questions, for real this time. And I suggest that you begin reading chapter 6 in the book. We'll talk some more on Thursday about the beginning of chapter 6, but it's a long one. So I think if you read to the chapter break on page 233, you'll be doing yourself a favor for reading this, getting ahead with this longer chapter. And, that's only, 30 pages? I think it should go relatively quickly for you. Okay. I'm going to stop share here for a moment, and then I'm going to share a different screen. I want to share with you, as I promised, an example of a persuasive essay. Now, this persuasive essay is kind of curious because it really does sort of factor into this sense of inductive reasoning that I think very much complements the persuasive essay style. Now, thinking back to our lecture on chapter 5 of our book, Practical Argument, remember that inductive reasoning starts by making a general summation, rather starts with a specific point and then moves to more general examples to support that. It's sort of the opposite of deductive logic, which moves from general to specific. Now, the structure of the essay itself really is up to you. You can write a traditional essay any way you wish to do so, but I'm just trying to suggest that inductive reasoning might be a little bit easier to construct a persuasive argument. And let's see how this student goes about doing just that. So they have their 4-line list. Looks like they forgot their date. The day it's turned in. So we'll have to highlight that as a reminder. So now they have their 4-line list. It is single spaced. And they have the name, the page number in the upper right-hand corner. They do not have to have their last name, but that's not something I'm a stickler for. You should, though, make sure that you have your name, my name, the name of the class, and the date that it's turned in. Remember that our assignment due date this time will be October 30th, so I can pencil that in as an example. They have a title. Can money buy happiness? Remember that when you create a unique title, it should not be in quotation marks. It should not be bolded or italicized, but in plain Times New Roman style, 12-point size font. And they begin with an attempt at a hook. It's a little bit ham-handed, though. I'll read it for you, and you can see what you think. You can make your own decision. Trying to obtain the most amount of money that you possibly can is something you shouldn't do in order to be happy will sound crazy. And right there, I messed that up. And I put a comment here on the site, can you clean this up a bit? I like where you're going, but the sentence structure is muddled. So I might revise about this initial sentence. It should probably say something like, it may sound crazy, but striving to obtain money to secure happiness will not deliver on the promise of true pleasure. Even Mr. Fowler has typos on occasion, right? So again, it's still not great, but just doing it off the cuff, I think I've cleaned it up enough to the point that it makes a little bit more sense. To a lot of people, the pursuit of ever larger amounts of money becomes a drive that defines not only their careers, but their very lives. The belief that material wealth and its exhibition will fix all problems in life and create a soothing curtain protecting one's purse against all else is a common sight these days. The mind leaps to celebrities such as George Clooney, known to hide away from the world on a luxury yacht, or Leonardo DiCaprio, who whiles away the hours on a private island. These are instances of conspicuous consumption at its best. Imagine, though, if you will, an ordinary person interviewing one or more of the fortunate 1%. What if they asked, when you became wealthy, did that end your problems? Their response may be a little more than a strange look. Happiness, it seems, doesn't directly equate to material wealth. It is essentially an intrinsic goal that one must pursue. So, oops, I didn't mean to highlight that. What we have here is a pretty interesting topic or first introductory paragraph with hopefully elaborate reasons that would follow. But we do have a fairly concise and precise thesis statement to wrap up that initial paragraph, which is atypical of student writing styles. That doesn't mean you should change your writing style, but remember, you can place your thesis anywhere that you wish in your paper. In this case, I think it works well for what the student's intent is, which is, again, to start with a specific example and then, or start with a specific statement and then elaborate on a host of more specific examples to prove the general ideas that they're laying out in the initial paragraph. Again, you have a movement from specific to general examples to shore up the initial argument. In 2014, notable actor and Oscar winner Robin Williams appeared to have a picture-perfect life from the outside. So now they're moving to a very specific example. He had millions of dollars, a successful career both on and off camera, admirations from his peers, and a large fan base that showered him with love. When he decided to take his life, it was shocking, and many wondered how a person with so much going on for them would want to end his life. An exploration of this complex actor and comedian can provide us with the means to analyze the tensions inherent in all of us. In order to fully appreciate the complexity of such a performer, it's first necessary to define the terms of said analysis. Thus, let's define the terms extrinsic and intrinsic. That's a really good move anytime you're trying to persuade an audience to your position. Because whether or not you're able to successfully argue from your perspective, one of the things that you need to do is make sure that you and your audience are in agreement or have an understanding about initial terms. Now, I've said this a number of times before, but I think it bears repeating. I am not a very political person. I don't really have a very keen interest in politics. I think that's something that is the private right of every American citizen. And in colleges today, we often push politics to the forefront of every class, but that's best left to history and political science classes, in my opinion. As such, I want to be very cautious about this next example. Okay. Now, I'm not going to advocate for one side or the other for the upcoming election, but I want to make reference to the debate. One thing that came out of the first presidential debate was a sort of disdain, I think, from all viewers about how unprofessional both men were. And as someone who has taught, basic principles about written argumentation, one of the things I would have hoped that they would have done instead of reacting the way they did would have been to come to terms or come to some sort of agreement on basic terms that they could have used to perhaps establish a dialogue rather than shouting over each other. That's a breakdown in communication. Okay. Now, back to the example. I think that this is a good move because in order to understand this writer's argument, you have to understand what extrinsic and intrinsic motivation are. A reader may know a lot about both of those terms, but they also may not. And since we can't count on that as writers, part of our due diligence is tied up with this idea of making sure that they do understand what it is we're discussing. So they say that the appeal of material objects is fleeting. The pursuit of pleasure, defined by some as hedonism, originates from the Greek. While various definitions of hedonism abound, one of the oldest forms derives from the Carvaka, an Indian philosophical tradition from around 600 BCE. Now, according to the Carvaka, hedonism is defined as the right action being the one that brings the actor the most net pleasure. This, of course, relates to pleasure that results from elements both material and immaterial. In the United States, it could be argued, notice the nice use of wiggle words there, it could be argued that the current emphasis on pleasure stems from the pursuit of more material objects. Such objects like sports cars, luxurious homes, or private yachts are extrinsic. Essentially, extrinsic happiness, then, is that which can be obtained from retail. Once you obtain these baubles or objects, the luster of the fervently desired bauble tends to fade. This effect is part of an experience referred to as a hedonic treadmill. As defined by author Shane Frederick, quote, the lack of evidence for a relationship between objective circumstances and reported well-being has given rise to the concept on which humans' happiness remains stationary despite efforts or interventions to advance it. When people begin to care more about the task of getting something than the actual object or status they're pursuing, the value of said object diminishes. And when that condition reaches its apex, many times people collapse from within. However, in the balance of life, peace of mind never costed a thing, or never cost a thing. I think that would be a good change here for our student to make. Again, even Mr. Fowler makes an error now and then, but I think when they costed, I'm not even sure that's a word. I think they may have made an error there, but never cost a thing. I want to pause for just a quick moment here. Notice the quotations and the internal citations which go on here. Just as a reminder, because I know this is easy to forget, when you introduce a quotation, you have to introduce the quotes, then place the quote itself, then you have your end quote, then the parenthetical citation, and then the period at the end. So it's quotation, parentheses, period. And this is a particularly unique example of an in-text citation or a parenthetical, meaning in parentheses, citation, because it has its own quotation marks around the word hedonism. So let's skip ahead to the works cited page. Don't worry, I'll come back. And here we see, aha, hedonism is a defined entry in a longer work, which is listed here in APA style. Notice that we've got works cited page centered title. Each entry is alphabetical according to the author or the keyword referenced in the in-text citation. And all of the entries are double spaced with a hanging indentation. Remember that to find a hanging indentation, you can simply look for the paragraph option on your version of WordPerfect or your version of Microsoft Word. Drop it down, and then you can see I already have a special. You can have none in terms of your indentation. You can have an indented so it leads to the first line, or you can have it as hanging, and you simply select the second line. I'll show you what none looks like. See, it's all the way flush with the left-hand margin, but we don't want that. We want to be in standard with APA, which means we want it to be hanging. And if we click OK, it applies it for us. You don't need to tab over and measure using the line or anything like that. You can actually make your indentation using your paragraph button. Okay, back to the text itself. Now we've defined our key terms. Now we're going to return to the example, the specific example that defines the general observation. Robin Williams is a perfect example of a person who obtained financial and career success. Yet he still battled with depression, regardless of his financial situation. One can't help but wonder whether or not a balance of intrinsic-based happiness could have had a more positive impact upon his decisions. In addition to finding happiness and success in the material world, happiness can stem from within. This is what's referred to as intrinsic happiness. While the products of intrinsic happiness aren't tangible, they're significant in a person's life. After all, Williams was one of the co-founding members of Comic Relief. He supported causes like Doctors Without Borders, and he even advocated on behalf of those with attention deficit syndrome. Yet he also clearly felt very alone. Perhaps his case was more complex, but if he had been surrounded by a culture that embraced intrinsic happiness, he may not have decided to take his own life. A lot of wiggle room there for potential. And I can think of several counter arguments that I might be able to raise, especially about the complexities of mental health. So I'm not sure that this is how convincing this particular argument has been or how persuasive the student really is. They're pretty effective in designing an essay that creates a presentation for an argument, but they may have wanted to spend more time thinking about the psychological ramifications for depression rather than argue about the examples. So I don't know. That's your mileage may vary. They start with a nice use of a transitional phrase in conclusion, which cues up the final paragraph here. Money cannot buy you happiness. Sort of restate their thesis statement in slightly different terms. Peace of mind can't be purchased, and no amount of money you can spend will allow your mind to feel that emotion. So they summed up their argument. It's something within your heart that only you can correct. Again, the wording could be stronger here, I think. This could be a little bit more clear. It's been said by many, but perhaps most famously by Christopher George Latour Wallace, better known as Biggie Smalls, that more money leads to more problems. Perhaps this is why George Clooney teamed with several other celebrities to form Not on Our Watch, a humanitarian organization, and why Leonardo DiCaprio has transformed his private island off the coast of Belize into a resort called Blackador Cay. Now, I like the echo effect by referencing George Clooney and Leonardo DiCaprio in the introduction and the conclusion. I think that's a very effective way to bring that information back into our minds as we're reading the piece. However, again, if he had spent less time on the examples and a little bit more time fundamentally underscoring his philosophy with better, more concrete examples, it would have, I think, been a more effective piece in terms of actually persuading his or her audience to believe their position. So your mileage on that piece of the concept may vary. Personally, I seek happiness from myself, my family, and the relationship I have with the Lord. I also enjoy being the crutch for a person having a hard time. Helping others find happiness through their difficulties is a satisfying experience. And it's important for individuals to have an intrinsic motivator to add positivity to their lives. Without the sense of value that emanates from within, happiness is only a fleeting sensation. Lasting and valuable happiness must, therefore, be defined as mostly intrinsic. Okay, and then, of course, we conclude with the works cited. 968 words in total, so he wrote more than the 850 words necessary. And as you can see, that's not even, it's close to 3 complete pages. Let's see here. If I can highlight this. And then I do word count here. Word count. He's at 700, or I shouldn't say he, because I don't remember if it was a fellow or a lady. But the student is at 702 words. Let's see, where's 850 tap out at? Maybe if I highlight all the text and just not the words cited page. Now, look at that, 892. So at that amount, it's, I think I said it roughly equivalent to about 4 pages. It's technically closer to 3, right? So about 3 pages gets the check for the word count completed. All right, I'm going to minimize that for a minute and stop share. So that's about it for today's session. I hope that, hold on, I've got to click that off. Okay, I hope that this was valuable for you. I think that the example will really help to shore up your initial efforts. This week, you should be working on your weekly discussion question and then sort of calculating a little bit in your head about what prompt you want to address for the essay, and just revisit some questions about what you think you might need to know about the research process and how to access good source material. That's going to be our focus for Thursday's class. I'm hoping to get one of our reference librarians involved. I might even share some time with her so that she can help you reference some ideas with regard to your upcoming projects. If she's unavailable, I will still have a session dedicated to the research process so that we can figure out what exactly it is we want to do in preparation for those for that essay project, the persuasive essay. Okay, that's it for Mr. Fowler. Thanks so much for your time and attention. I'll talk to you later this week, and have a good time. Take care, everyone.